from the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Let's see. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Victoria Hill, Acting Chief of the Humanities and Social Sciences Division. On behalf of HSS and the Library of Congress, I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's talk by Dr. Francile Roussan Wilson. The lecture is part of our ongoing series of programs in the Humanities and Social Sciences Division. In researching her book, The Segregated Scholars, Dr. Wilson made extensive use of the library's collections, both general and special. She frequently used the resources available via the main reading room, and she used no fewer than 10 manuscript collections, including the papers of Mary Church Terrell, and the organizational records of the NAACP and the National Women's Trade Union. I would like to thank Sybil Moses, Main Reading Room Reference Specialist in African American History and Culture, for suggesting Dr. Wilson as a speaker and for coordinating the details which made this talk possible. She's been assisted by Leroy Bell, Julius Jefferson, and Elizabeth Jenkins Jaffe, also reference librarians in HSS, and Ava Everett of the Copyright Acquisitions Division. You've probably seen some of these folks in the back of the room welcoming you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them as you leave. Please be aware that the entire program, including the question and answer period, is being taped by the Library of Congress. By asking a question, you are implicitly giving permission for the Library of Congress to broadcast the same. And now to introduce our speaker is Sybil Moses, the Reference Specialist for African American History and Culture in HSS. Sybil.
Good afternoon, and as always, I greet you in peace and solidarity. It is both an honor and a privilege to host Dr. Francile Roussan Wilson, author of The Segregated Scholars. Dr. Wilson is the foremost chronicler of scholarly achievement in the field of Black intellectuals and their creation of African American labor studies. It is extremely difficult to think about workers without thinking about labor and without thinking about labor organizations. It's also impossible to separate these three elements from our desire to achieve social, economic, and political justice. Studies about workers provide an important link. They are the tools needed to assess the degree to which we are actually achieving equality in that struggle for social, economic, and political justice. And so today, we celebrate Negro workers, studies of workers and labor activities, and the Black historians of these social scientific studies. Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for calling our attention to these works. We would not know the details of these studies, nor about the lives of the people who undertook these studies, had it not been for the scholarship that you have provided. We are fortunate to have Dr. Francile Wilson with us today because she is leaving the area to be a visiting professor at the University of Southern California, where her husband, Dr. Ernest J. Wilson, is the newly appointed Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication. So today's event is a very special one for all of us. It's an opportunity to celebrate Dr. Wilson and the Segregated Scholars and to wish her well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone here for coming, and I want to thank the Library of Congress staff for inviting me to speak today about these amazing Black social scientists. I particularly want to thank Dr. Sybil Moses, a fantastic historian in her own right, who's written quite a bit about Black life in New Jersey, as well as Black fraternal organizations and mutual benefit societies. And I'd also like to thank her committee for all the hard work that they've done leading up to this and for today. But I'd also like to take this opportunity to publicly acknowledge and to thank Dr. Moses and all the specialists, reference librarians, technicians, and archivists at the Library of Congress who helped me to better understand the lives and works of these scholar activists. And there are also other people in the audience from other archives who have like the National Archives, the Labor Department, and other archives that I use, Moreland Spingarn, who I'd like to publicly thank as well. None of these things would get done without your assistance, and very often we find things because you help us. Be the truth what it may, I shall seek it on the pure assumption that it is worth seeking. I am striving to make my life all that life may be, with others of my brothers and sisters making their lives similar. I am willing to sacrifice and work for the rise of the Negro people. These are my plans: to make a name in science, to make a name in literature, and thus to raise my race. I wonder what will be the outcome. Diary entry, 23rd February, 1893, by W.E.B. Du Bois. In these words, written after a solitary celebration of his 25th birthday in Berlin, where he was a graduate student, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois looked ahead to a life as a scholar and intellectual that was both grounded and bounded by race and ambition. Du Bois, a poor orphan, was brashly planned to join with other black men and women as he made a name in the academy and changed the status of his people. His first four guiding principles: seeking the truth through objective scholarship, envisioning race research as a collective effort, requiring education for race leadership, and demanding social and political reforms, would fully engage Du Bois for the rest of his life. And as I argue in my recent book, The Segregated Scholars, these four ideals would also animate and serve as touchstones for more than 15 young black men and women who became social scientists and activists during the first half of the 20th century. In making their lives and goals similar to Du Bois, black social scientists collectively created the field of black labor studies during a period when black workers faced blatant discrimination from employers and fierce opposition from most unions. This brief talk will focus on the interaction of race, labor, and gender politics during the first half of the 20th century, a critical period for both black workers and for the black social scientists who studied them and championed their causes. When I began the research that would lead to the book, The Segregated Scholars, I knew two things. First, nearly all of the major studies of black workers before 1950 were written by black social scientists. And secondly, virtually every black social scientist writing before 1950 wrote at least one monograph or article on black workers. I didn't know why black workers were so important to black but not to white social scientists and labor historians. In order to study why that was, I first had to learn who these men really were. And at first, I was studying mostly men. And if their interest in black workers was the result of a stunning set of coincidences lasting over 50 years, or if they were, in Du Bois's words, brothers and sisters making their lives similar. I thought it was the latter case long before I found that quote. I knew they knew each other, but I had to prove this to a skeptical academy who had never heard of Charles Wesley, Ira Reid, or even Carter G. Woodson. I turned to the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress, as so many of you know, is an amazing resource for researchers, and I use nearly every part of it, from its unparalleled collection of books, reports, periodicals, and dissertations on Black life and history, its rich manuscript collections which offer personal and institutional history. I also use the Children's Literature Unit, the comic book collections, and the records of the Copyright Office to locate rare materials written by Black female social scientists. And finally, I turned to the photography department for several of the illustrations in this book. It was in the manuscript collections, particularly those of the NAACP and the Urban League, that I first located the correspondence and studies that demonstrated to me that the studies of Black workers begun by Du Bois and continued by two successive generations were a part of a larger self-conscious ongoing strategy of racial uplift with Black workers at its center. The Urban League papers also shed light on its co-founder, George Edmund Haynes, a protege of Du Bois. And I also discovered at the Library of Congress that a second generation of sociologists and economists, including Charles S. Johnson, Ira Reid, and Abram Harris, each began their careers after World War I by working for the Urban League and had important relationships with the NAACP during the Depression and World War II. These insights led me deeper into the collections, to the Booker T. Washington papers for important information about opposition to Du Bois, and to the politics of his first cadre of male sociologists who were often friends of both Du Bois and Washington. Both the National Urban League papers and the NAACP papers had critical information on the organization's responses to the labor crises of the Depression and World War II, which I detail in chapters 4 and 6. Now, you probably can't see this, but I just wanted to let you see, try to see one page from this. In this case is actually, I'm sure this is in the National Urban League papers, but I copied this from the Nannie Helen Burroughs papers, and it's called Unemployment Among Negroes, Activities of the National Urban League, Data on 25 Industrial Centers, prepared by T. Arnold Hill, who was the director of its Department of Industrial Relations, and Ira D.A. Reid, director of the Research and Investigations. Ira Reid left the Urban League and became a very important sociologist, writing a number of books and eventually becoming the president of the Eastern Sociological Association. I also examined the materials held here on historian Carter G. Woodson and the papers of white progressives such as Assistant Secretary of Labor Louis Post, and the Breckinridge papers for Sophie Sonia Breckinridge, who aided Black social scientists in their quest for objectivity and advocacy for workers' rights. Sometimes I found things that led me to see the difference in ideology, and this is from the Urban League papers, and it's a set of talking points for the Urban League to use. It's called Suggested Arguments to Use in Appealing to Employers for Jobs for Negroes. This is something that was written around 1930, and it begins to talk about what kind of attitudes whites might have. They would have the slave concept, economic priorities, traditions, and how to counter these ideas. This led me to better understand the opposition of young radicals like Abram Harris in the 30s to some of the programs that were happening. In really beginning to understand, so the Library of Congress helped me to be confident that there was a network of Black social scientists that were working self-consciously together, that were mentoring each other, that were creating institutions that would create more social scientists. But over time, a very long time, I began to realize that my emphasis on looking at the lives and works of activist academics who were interconnected for at least 20 years might brightly illuminate male networks, but left the actions of their sisters and wives in the dark. Once again, I turned to the Library of Congress, searching through the papers of Mary Church Terrell, Nannie Helen Burroughs, the National Women's Trade Union League, in order to clarify the additional burden of gender faced by Black women who shared the same goals as their brothers, fathers, and husbands, but the archival evidence was a lot more skimpy. In this work, as in most studies, I also used the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. I used the National Archives for the Labor Department, and people like Robert C. Weaver, who were officials during the New Deal. But it was in the Library of Congress that helped me to determine the possibility of this study and helped me recreate it. In my next book, I want to explore further just how and why Black women's research and advocacy was marginalized in the past and continues to be marginalized in the present. Why were Black workers so important to so many generations of Black workers? Black intellectuals had twin ambitions. They wanted to become excellent scholars, and they wanted to use their scholarship to advance their race at a time of Jim Crow and almost unimaginable oppression. The Black men and women who became social scientists, often against great odds, believed that the labor problem was fundamental, to quote the words of Helen Brooks Irvin, a talented analyst during World War I, who has slipped from the pages of history after writing a few very important studies of Black women workers. Echoing Helen Irvin's idea of the centrality of labor was Robert Weaver. When he was a young Harvard graduate student, Weaver wrote Du Bois about his dissertation topic in the midst of the Great Depression, quoting Weaver. "I plan to work on something in the field of Negro labor. Indeed, I cannot see how a person interested in the economic life of the Black American could hope to escape the treating of the Negro worker." Every one of the segregated scholars, the 15 men and women that are I extensively chronicle, and virtually all other Black social scientists from the 1890s through 1950 shared this idea, and most of them made a similar declaration, often writing to Du Bois when they were in undergraduate or graduate school. And that's one of the exciting things about research. You're reading a microfilm, and you're reading this cramped penmanship, and somebody says, you know, "Dear Dr. Du Bois, I'm an undergraduate student at UCLA, and I want to join you in changing the race." And you look down and it says, "Ralph Bunche." And you're like, oh my goodness. And of course, there are many aha moments like that in the archives. So many that sometimes it seems like you'll never finish. Du Bois returned to the United States in 1894 with his fare to his home in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and to use his words, $2 additional. But he quickly began to encounter other like-minded black men and women who were turning to the social sciences, Howard University's Kelly Miller and R.R. Wright Sr., the president of Georgia State College of Industry for Colored Youth. Now, R.R. Wright Sr. was a very interesting man, and he was also a trustee of Atlanta University. And while the Atlanta University was a private school and it had lost state money for insisting on teaching black people Greek and Latin, and Wright was losing the battle to have academic courses at his own school, but he persuaded the Atlanta University trustees and its president, Bumstead, to hire Du Bois, who is not quite 30 years old, and to come and continue an important annual research conference that Wright himself had started. Du Bois often lets us think that he started this conference, but Wright and other black college graduates started this conference, got the first 2 studies done, had them published by the Department of Labor, and then they brought Du Bois to continue the conference and to create a sociology program at Atlanta University. Howard and Atlanta University had among the first sociology programs in the South. They had programs there even before white colleges in the South had programs, because black intellectuals believed that sociology and not sentiment were going to rule in the 20th century. And they wanted to do these objective studies and have plans for black people based on those studies. And as many of you in this audience know, those Atlanta University studies are the basis of both American sociology and the sociological knowledge that we have on black people. Within a dozen years of Du Bois's birthday declaration, through this striving, he had established these foundations, and his initial cadre included Wright's own son, Bishop, who later became an AME bishop, R.R. Wright Jr., Monroe Work, and George Edmund Haynes, and even Carter G. Woodson, who would quickly institutionalize black students' opportunities for research, scholarship, and social activism. Wright Jr. and Monroe Work both entered the University of Chicago in 1898 as undergraduates in order to study theology, but they quickly became sociologists as well, with Du Bois giving them advice, publishing opportunity, and research jobs on his projects. Both men left Chicago about 1904. Dr. Moses is an expert on Monroe Work, who became perhaps the first bibliographer of African Americans. And Wright went to the University of Pennsylvania and tried to recreate Du Bois's Philadelphia Negro, where he earned a PhD in 1911, the second black American to earn a degree in sociology. George Edmund Haynes co-founded the National Urban League in 1910. He was a Fisk graduate, and you'll hear a little bit more about him in a minute. He also created a social science department at Fisk, and for a while, Haynes was teaching at Fisk during most of the year and running the Urban League over Christmas holidays and summers, but he was making so little money that he and his wife were raising chickens and selling eggs, and also selling cattle off of his mother-in-law's Alabama farm. So when I say these people worked at great sacrifice, the lives that they chose did not give them much money, but they gave them great pleasure. In one of his very first students at Fisk, where he began teaching only 7 years after his own graduation, was Charles Harris Wesley, at the time a Fisk Jubilee singer and a talented quarterback. Despite Wesley's preference for history rather than sociology, Haynes saw that Wesley got the same scholarship to Yale that he had received some years earlier. And in the summer before his graduation from Yale, Wesley was earning money singing in Atlantic City with the famed tenor Roland Haynes. And he met Louis Baxter Moore, who was the dean of Howard University's Teachers College and a Fisk alumni. Moore promised Wesley a job at Howard when he finished his master's degree. And Wesley became, after 1915, Wesley became one of Carter G. Woodson's main lieutenants in the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. I'm telling you this to give you an idea of the interlocking relationships that these scholars had. As they're writing about black workers, they're helping each other to get things published. Carter G. Woodson will not only found the Association for the Study of African American Life and History in 1915, he's founded the Journal of Negro History in 1916 and created his own publishing company in order for scholarly works to come out, and also funded about 20 black historians' graduate degrees. Now, I could continue to tell you how more than 15 black men had these relationships, but gender was also important in the development of black social scientists. This is Lorenzo Green, who is another protege of Woodson and Wesley's. He was a Howard graduate. Abram Harris. If you didn't go to Fisk, a good place to go was Virginia Union, because the people at the National Urban League headquarters were Virginia Union graduates. Abram Harris was a talented Virginia Union graduate who got employed by the Urban League and used their fellows program, as many other people, including Charles S. Johnson, did, to get masters, work as professionals in the Urban League branches, and then to later become social scientists. In Harris's case, he became an economist and for many years led the economics department at Howard, writing an important book, The Black Worker, with Sterling Sparrow. Now, black women faced an additional barrier that their husbands and brothers did not: sexism. Consider, if you will, the case of Elizabeth Ann Ross, George Haynes's classmate from the Fisk class of 1903. Elizabeth Ross' schooling and early career illustrates the difficulties faced by black women who wanted to work as social scientists at the turn of the century. Both Ross and her future husband, Haynes, were talented children of slave-born parents. When Ross began her college studies in 1900 at Fisk University, there were only 70 black public high school students in the entire state of her native Alabama, 70. There were no, I want to say that again, no black students enrolled in college-level courses in the state-supported colleges in Alabama or George Haynes's home state of Arkansas. So the work of Fisk, Atlanta University, and Howard to train black social scientists, to train black educators can't be understated, because the state segregated schools simply were not training or graduating people with bachelor's degrees. Now, Ross's years at Fisk brought her accolades from the faculty that matched and even exceeded George Haynes's. In fact, Haynes's own close friend, the chaplain, told him that when he received his doctorate, that Chaplain Morrow's wife had to regularly remind Fisk faculty members that Elizabeth Ross was the intellectual equal or better of George Haynes. Mrs. Morrow says to them, he wrote, "Oh, but you ought to see our Elizabeth," intimating that if they did, George would not be in it. Now, why is this? The reason for this is that the curriculum at places like Fisk, Howard, and Atlanta University tended to take women on a separate track. Women took courses in domestic sciences that did not allow them to graduate with the same sort of degree that their male counterparts did. Therefore, in order for them to go to graduate school, they basically had to get a second BA, and this is what Elizabeth Ross Haynes attempted to do. Now, by the time they had been married, they got married in 1910, and here's a picture from Who's Who in Colored America, also first seen at the Library of Congress. And this is about 1930. Now, by 1930, George Haynes has a PhD, but it would take Elizabeth Ross Haynes 20 additional years to get a master's. And because she was married, when George Haynes became an executive at the Department of Labor during World War I, Elizabeth Ross was unable to work because they had nepotism rules, and she had to serve as a $1 a year worker, which limited her ability to fully contribute. But her 1923 dissertation on black domestic workers stood for almost 30 years as one of the most important studies of black workers, and it was published by Carter G. Woodson in the Journal of Negro History. In order to find out more about whether Elizabeth Ross Haynes really wanted to be a sociologist, another thing I found in the main reading room was a very hard to find document on the New York State Temporary Commission on the Condition of the Urban Colored Population, a mouthful, in a commission that existed in the 30s. And initially, Elizabeth Ross Haynes was the only woman on the commission. In the second year, another woman, this is the second report, was appointed. And I can also see from this that a number of other black sociologists, or people who will be sociologists, Charles L. Franklin, an early black political scientist, William Pickens, an activist in the NAACP, are on the executive staff of this commission, also Dean Yarborough, a sociologist, and Lester Granger, Urban League executive, were on the commission staff. So it's through documents like this that I'm able to recreate the fact that Elizabeth Ross Haynes was not really content in being a housewife, but found different ways to continue working about black workers. This is a drawing of Gertrude Elise McDougall. And as Elise Johnson McDougall, she wrote a very important essay called The Double Task, The Struggle of Negro Women for Sex and Race Emancipation. McDougall illustrates one of the problems in finding out things about black women. As Gertrude Ayer, she was the principal author of A New Day for the Colored Woman Worker, which is in your bibliography. When she was writing in The New Negro, she was Elise Johnson McDougall. And when I began to try to find out who Gertrude McDougall was, I discovered that literary people had studied Elise Johnson McDougall. A few social scientists had looked at Gertrude McDougall. No one had figured out that Gertrude McDougall became Gertrude Ayer, or that Elise Johnson McDougall was the same person. And so that one thing, men's names generally stay stable, women's names are different. But this is an important essay because she begins to talk about racism and sexism and actually how they affect the black community, how they affect parents and children, and what it's like to have your children not respect you because you are an ordinary worker. McDougall was not able to go to college due to her physician father's sexism, but she worked as a labor activist, as a teacher. It was possible to be a teacher without having a college degree before World War I, and she became the second black person in New York to be a school principal. And as a school principal, she inspired many students, including James Baldwin. Now, another woman who seemed to have the possibility to skip all the barriers that were in place for Elizabeth Ross Haynes and Gertrude McDougall Ayer was Sadie Moselle Tanner Alexander. And Sadie Alexander was the niece of Louis Baxter Moore, who had helped Charles Wesley get a job. She grew up in Washington at her uncle's home at Howard. She earned 3 degrees in quick order from the University of Pennsylvania. And at the age of 23, became the first black person to earn a PhD in economics, which she earned from the Wharton School. And she suddenly discovered that she could not get a job in black or white America. She said this was a picture that she was in all of the black and much of the white press, but she ruefully would say later, all the glory of that day faded, however, when I couldn't get a position. Now, here you have someone, 23 years old, PhD from the Wharton School. How much would that person make today? They could set their number, right? And certainly it would be in the 6 figures, and certainly it would be more than I currently earn. And I thought, her professors are racist. I discovered that her professors actually threatened not to place anyone that year if she couldn't get a job. Now, she was the first person. There were no people with PhDs in economics. Why couldn't she get a job in a black university? Her grandfather, an AME bishop, was on the board of trustees of Howard. This lets us know if Sadie can't get a job, no one can get a job. She did get a job as an assistant actuary at North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company, I'm sure through the intervention of her family. You do not need a PhD to be an assistant actuary. Alexander would, after 2 years of, she didn't, in Philadelphia, it was also impossible for her to teach in high school. Black women could only teach at the elementary level. So she went to law school, and despite discrimination there, became a very prominent lawyer working in her husband's firm. Now, the Depression and World War II created a major crisis for black people that neither the NAACP nor the Urban League seemed able to address. Robert C. Weaver, this is a picture of him when he was in the early 60s after he's become the head of Housing and Urban Development. But when he was fresh out of graduate school and about 26 years old, Weaver and his high school classmate, John P. Davis, a brilliant Harvard Law educated attorney, launched a two-man assault from a retired worker's borrowed storefront on 7th Street. They began to research and argue in front of the National Recovery Administration that black workers in coal, steel, and other industries should not have discriminatory wage and hour laws. This so embarrassed the NAACP that they created something called a joint committee on economic recovery to support Weaver and Davis, and joined with George Edmund Haynes and other people to try to really make a difference for black workers and to try to support the activities of the CIO. Weaver ended up joining the Roosevelt administration, becoming a very important part of what was called the Black Cabinet, along with Mary McLeod Bethune. And by the end of World War II, Robert Weaver had designed the first federal affirmative action program, which placed black skilled workers on construction jobs that were building the segregated housing projects. Now, there was a lot of irony in this, but we have to remember that segregation was legal, and Weaver and William Hastie created this program that successfully used quotas. Du Bois, in the 30s, was fired from the NAACP, and he returned to Atlanta University, working along, here he's shown giving a radio address with Ira Reid, who had become a sociologist and was on the staff of Atlanta University, and the historian Rayford Logan, who was then at Atlanta University. They used radio addresses and set up a people's college to fight for civil and economic rights. At the end of the war, Robert Weaver predicted that the failure to provide full post-war jobs for black people would lead to urban unrest. Like its predecessors, Weaver believed that black workers were the key to solving black people's economic problems. If there weren't enough jobs and no commitment to equal opportunities, then racial conflict would surely intensify. To him, without full employment, the stakes were high. He said in his seminal book, The Negro Labor, it's work or fight on the color line. Sadie Alexander used her this is a picture, I'll come back to this. Sadie Alexander used her economics and legal skills when appointed to President Truman's Civil Rights Committee in 1947 to ensure that the political, economic, and social welfare rights denied to black citizens were documented and at least partially addressed in the desegregation of the Army and in their important report to secure these rights. Some years later, Lyndon Johnson would use the unfinished promises of that document to launch the war on poverty. While the last generation of black social scientists' impact lasted well into the 1960s and 70s, black social scientists who were trained in the 40s did not continue their studies of black workers into the 50s and beyond, ending 50 years of research and advocacy on behalf of black workers. In my book, I speculate that perhaps this is because of the civil rights movement, perhaps it's because people are interested in international affairs. Certainly, it's unfortunate because black workers continue to need serious and objective scholarship. At the moment that black scholars stopped looking at black workers, however, black white scholars who were impacted by the Holocaust and World War II did begin to start studying black workers, and so you had the radical Philip Foner and the Ray Marshall, who later became the Secretary of Labor, began to do study black workers in the 1960s. But the study of black workers by black social scientists was finished by early 1950 and ending a pretty amazing 50 years of research and advocacy on the part of black workers and whose impact still remains. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.